So, this is the lecture for Module 1 of our course on Alfred North Whitehead's magnum opus, Process and Reality, an essay in cosmology. And you should have just read up through page 38, I believe, to the end of part 1. And in part 1, Whitehead is laying out his speculative scheme. He talks about his method of speculative philosophy and argues that it's a valid form of knowledge production. He lays out his categorical scheme for us, right? His categories of existence and of explanation, his categorical obligations, and some derivative notions. And here, I think we need to think of part 1 of Whitehead's Process and Reality as a kind of dress rehearsal, as just a roll of the credits where we're introduced to the characters who will perform in this play, in this cosmological drama that he will lead us through. Parts 2 through 5 of Process and Reality will exhibit these categories listed for us in a very abstract and minimalist way. It's kind of sketched in this first part. And in parts 2 through 5, Whitehead is going to exhibit these in scientific theory, in physics and biology mostly. He's going to exhibit them as interpretations of religious experience as well as common sense experience. The complex texture of civilized thought, as he puts it, will find interpretation, he says, in terms of these categories that he's going to lay out for us here in part 1. Now, read the preface, read part 1, take a look at the table of contents, and once you've become sufficiently overwhelmed by its abstract nature, just remember that we're in this together, and that as we continue to read and Whitehead exhibits and applies these categories, we'll start to see what the heck he's talking about when he talks about an actual occasion or a concrescence or a prehension or the primordial and consequent nature of God. Right? He's going to tell us what he means later on in this 400-page book by bringing these categories to bear upon as interpretations of a history of religious experience that we all probably know very well, and to a set of scientific understandings that we also, modern scientific understandings that we also probably know pretty well. And he's going to draw also on the history of Western philosophy, and with some important gestures towards Eastern philosophies, Vedic and Buddhist traditions. And Whitehead is here doing, he says it's an essay in cosmology. And you'll remember that in this first module, I asked you to watch a couple of brief lectures by the famous American postmodern philosopher Richard Rorty, who was speaking at Stanford back in 2006, and then the response to Rorty by Isabel Stengers and Donna Haraway. And I think it's important to begin a course on Whitehead's Process and Reality and Whitehead's organic philosophy, or philosophy of organism, as he called it, with Rorty, because, Rorty is sort of the climax or the culmination of a certain stream of postmodern thought as it left the continent, France mostly, and traveled across the Atlantic to the United States of America. Rorty is interpreting for his American audience thinkers like Wittgenstein, thinkers like Heidegger and Derrida. And he's trying to tell us that all philosophy is a kind of linguistic criticism. There is no outside of language, according to Rorty. And so when he reads a book like Process and Reality claiming to produce knowledge of reality, he's clearly going to be suspicious. And, if you listen to his lecture, I think, Rorty's worth reading, a very important philosopher, makes important contributions to the philosophical conversation, as he would put it. But when he says things like that truth is what your colleagues let you get away with saying, I think that kind of linguistic idealism, or even linguistic solipsism, we might put it more strongly, is doing a disservice to the human species at this moment in our history when we are desperate we are literally dying to reach reality again. We're desperate for contact again with the world beyond us. So you have all these non-human turns, so-called, ironically at the same time that geologists are saying we've entered the Anthropocene. And, Rorty is the old guard trying to, and he studied with Quine, who studied with Whitehead, and so he knows Whitehead's thought, but I think in this brief little clip from one of his presentations at Stanford, Rorty is betraying a misunderstanding of Whitehead's philosophy, which is not to say that Whitehead isn't attempting to do something bold that cuts against the grain of dominant thought, especially in America. Rorty is I think, the best representative I could think of for what stands in the way of Whitehead's project in the United States, in the philosophical lineage that we inherit today as, thinkers inhabiting this continent. So, I wanted you to hear Rorty try to block progress along this path towards speculative philosophy. And I wanted you to hear also Haraway and Stengers's rebuttals, or responses at least, to Rorty. And what Haraway and Stengers are basically saying, inheriting from Whitehead this important point that we experience more than we can describe in language. There is an outside to language. And even Haraway and Stengers, making Whitehead's point, will say there are abstractions that exist and are effective in the world independently of human language. That abstraction, that form, in the way that Plato meant it, and the way that Whitehead means it as he creatively inherits Plato, form is a part of fact, of actuality, that there is something eternal ingredient in the passage of temporal fact, and that this eternal element, this archetypal power inherent in the nature of things, lures the world, lures the universe toward more intensity, more complexity of organization and of experience. And there's a goad toward novelty in evolution, and that it's not just a blind process, that there is actually a form of selection, that nature is a kind of hidden spirit, as Schelling once put it, one of the early modern process philosophers. And, so when Haraway wants to talk about her intuition of a erotic potency active in the cellular membranes that she's observing in her chemistry laboratory as a graduate student, that there's an erotic potency to that biological activity that exceeds her capacity to language, to speak about, to describe, or even to explain scientifically. And Rorty is saying you cannot claim that. All you can do is say that you have that experience, and it's always already in a kind of a priori way bound up with the language that you've learned to speak, the language games that you are playing. This is Rorty's linguistic idealism. Whitehead is not an idealist. He is a realist. There's a story about a lecture that Whitehead was giving, and he was in dialogue answering a question, not from another student, but someone he was co-teaching with at the time, and I'm forgetting this person's name, but they were an idealist, and Whitehead got frustrated at one point, and he said, you know, getting tackled in rugby, that is the real. That is our evidence that there is a world out there independently of us. But Whitehead's realism is still a kind of empiricism. It's based on experience. It's an experiential realism. What's finally real are actual occasions of experience. And so saying that being tackled in rugby is evidence of the reality of the world, and that it's not just a linguistic construct, is in a sense, for Whitehead, reality is a nexus of feeling, and that the exchange of force, what we would call causality in modern science, is an exchange of feeling. And in that way, it's a transaction whereby what is subjectively felt in one immediate moment by some actuality is then passed along and transformed from subjective immediacy into objective immortality, and that objectivity, or in Whitehead's terms, that superject of what had been a subject, gets inherited by the next drop of experience, the next actual occasion. So that becoming is a kind of perpetual perishing, Whitehead will say, but that there's a cumulative nature of this perpetual perishing, such that the experience in the present, as it becomes past and perishes, is then inherited, re-enlivened in the next moment, brought back to life in the next moment, experienced in a kind of subjective immediacy, and then again perishes into objective immortality. And that this rhythmic pulsation is cumulative, and that something is achieved through this process. And, Rorty is going to retort and say that this is just a way of speaking, and if that way of speaking is useful to you in some aspect of your everyday life, then great. Or if it's useful to you in science, or if it's useful to you in religion, then great. But it's just a way of speaking. Haraway and Stengers, Whitehead, the other Whiteheadian thinkers that we'll read a little bit of this semester, like Catherine Keller and Randall Auxier, Gary Herstein, they will all very clearly show that they are committed to realism, to the idea that something about the world and its activity goes beyond our capacity to language, and yet we know that it is there, we know that it is active, because we feel it, we intuit it. And Whitehead is saying, he's one of the important thinkers who is a mathematician and a logician, a very careful, systematic metaphysician, but he's also one who wants to say that feeling and emotion, romance, creativity, that these are valid ways of knowing, and not only valid, they are essential to philosophy, to cosmology, and to metaphysics. You can't just have logic and mathematics. In fact, logic and mathematics can mislead us in metaphysics. Because Whitehead says philosophy is not deduction, right? Philosophy is imaginative generalization and testing our generalizations in experience. It is not deduction. We don't come up with some a priori set of categories in advance and then use them to explain experience. It may seem like Whitehead's book Process and Reality is designed in precisely such a way, but he tells us right out in his first chapter on the speculative method that rationalism is an imaginative experiment. It's an adventure. We don't know in advance what's going to happen to us on an adventure. That's why it's an adventure. Doesn't mean we don't come up with categories, but it means we're constantly testing and revising them. We never claim to be finished. And so while in this first part, what we're reading is going to seem really abstract. Like, where did he get these categories? Like, categories of existence and categories of explanation and categorical obligations. I mean, what the hell is all of this? It seems, hopelessly abstract. But he didn't, even though he's listing these for us first, he arrived at these categories in the course of his exploration of modern physics and biology, in his explorations of religion and religious experience, both in himself and in the history of our species, and in his appreciation for poetry and art, and just the, as he calls it, the complex texture of civilized consciousness and experience. Whitehead is living a human life at his moment in history, and these categories are what occurred to him. He says philosophy does not create its own interpretations of fact or pure experience. Philosophy inherits interpretations from the culture within which it is born, and then criticizes those interpretations and refines them and improves them, hopefully. So all that is by way of introduction. I want to turn now to the actual content of Process and Reality, the preface, and then up through page 38, I believe. It's part 1, right? It's the speculative scheme. So let's just go through here, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, reviewing what really stands out about Whitehead tells us in these first 38 pages or so. Well, he says, first of all, in the preface, that his philosophy is a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought. So the Kantian turn, the Copernican revolution, as Kant called his own transcendental philosophy, is so important for modern and postmodern philosophy. Whitehead is saying he went back and read Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz and Locke and Berkeley and Hume and realized that there's a different path forward that doesn't have to go through Kant. Now, Whitehead's not going to ignore Kant, but the transcendental turn, he thinks, is a wrong turn. He wants to backtrack, start over before Kant, find a new pathway forward, a realistic pathway rather than an idealistic pathway, a constructive rather than critical pathway. So it's a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought, right? And what Whitehead is worried about in terms of that post-Kantian tradition through Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, then through to, in Whitehead's own day, Heidegger and Husserl were also thinking in the Kantian tradition. The problem Whitehead finds with it is that the post-Kantian tradition was too rigidly systematic. It paid more attention to its own abstract notions in its abstract, self-enclosed system than it did to concrete, the texture of concrete experience. And so these overly rigid systems did violence to experience. They did violence to the complex texture of civilized thought. So Whitehead goes back to the empiricists and the rationalists before Kant, and he tries to find a new pathway forward, right? So then in the preface, he lays out the structure of this book for us. In part 1, there's his methodology and his categorical scheme, and this is kind of like the dress rehearsal for the rest of the book. Part 2 is where he begins to exhibit the adequacy of the scheme he introduces in part 1 to various elements of our experience, especially modern physics and biology, but also common sense, religion, and art. In part 3, Whitehead lays out his theory of prehension, which we might literally just translate as feeling. It's his theory of feeling. In part 4, he lays out his theory of extension. And this isn't just a theory of space, it's a theory of space-time, or of some matrix prior to what physics describes as space-time. Extension for Whitehead could mean extension in space or in time. It's a topological notion, more general, though, than either space or time. So that's part 4. And then in part 5 is Whitehead's final interpretation, where he really inaugurates process theology, or I guess he inaugurates that in earlier texts. There's a chapter on God in Science and the Modern World, and there's a whole book on God in Religion in the Making, which were lectures that he delivered before the lectures that became Process and Reality. But the final interpretation is Whitehead's expression of the way that this cosmological scheme fits in to the nature of God, to the divine nature. And it's when we get to part 5, we'll start to read some of Catherine Keller's process theology, where she carries forward Whitehead's novel form of God talk in a really beautiful way. So Whitehead says in his preface, at the end, insofar as the enterprise has been successful, this essay in cosmology, this speculative scheme has been successful, there should be no problem of space-time, or of epistemology, or of causality left over for discussion. The scheme, Whitehead continues, should have developed all those generic notions adequate for the expression of any possible interconnection of things. That's on page 7 of the preface. So Whitehead then tells us that he wants to rescue the pragmatic tradition in the United States, starting with William James, moving through John Dewey. He wants to rescue it from the charge of anti-intellectualism. He also says this of Bergson, who was so influenced James especially, as well as Whitehead. He wants to rescue these figures from the charge of anti-intellectualism. He then says that he's emphasizing some notion of feeling. Whitehead's technical neologism for feeling is prehension, but he's emphasizing feeling as part of his metaphysical repudiation of what he calls vacuous actuality. Vacuous actuality is this notion that's pervasive throughout modern philosophy in Whitehead's estimation. The idea that the natural world, the non-human world, the realm outside of human consciousness is just bare, mute fact. And that, there's no sound or scent or color. There's no qualitative richness to the non-human world, that nature poets should congratulate themselves for the beauty of the nightingale's song, for the splendor of the sunset. Because all of the glory and the beauty, the subjective richness and intensity of experience, that's all being added by the human. All the meaning, all the value is being added by the subject, the conscious subject, and none of it is present in nature as such. That's this notion of vacuous actuality that Whitehead is repudiating, right? He says outside the experience or the feeling of actual occasions that there's nothing. That's the most abstract notion one could have, is this idea of vacuous matter, devoid of feeling. Whitehead is completely tossing that idea out. He's also asking us to accept several other, that he's asking us to accept that several other habits of thought are erroneous and also need to be repudiated. Not only this notion of vacuous actuality, but he says we have to get over our distrust of speculative philosophy. And, the thing is, Whitehead is articulating this new cosmology, this new metaphysical scheme in 1929, after a decade of where the philosophical world saw the emergence and the ascendance of logical positivism, right? And at the same time, by the mid-1920s, the new quantum and relativity theories in the physical science had demolished the old Newtonian mechanical philosophy of nature, right? These new physical theories had turned matter into light. They'd merged space and time together with gravity, such that the classical explanations, the mechanistic explanations of nature, no longer offered a coherent explanation, a coherent account of the natural world. A second scientific revolution took place, we might say. And so, Whitehead begins to philosophize in this context, coming out of mathematics and physics, but he's entering into philosophy at the same moment that Wittgenstein, Rorty's hero, is closing the door on further metaphysical speculation about the ultimate nature of things. Wittgenstein famously says, "Whereof one cannot speak, Thereof one must remain silent, right? He says that in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, this important founding book, really, founding text for the logical positivists. So there are these physicists struggling to come to terms with their discoveries, right, in quantum and relativity theory. But they at the same time, philosophers are telling them they can expect no help from them in terms of understanding what reality is, because all philosophy can do is analyze language. There is no access to reality. And so I think the result of this, philosophy closing the door on realism, just as quantum and relativity theories are deepening the physical sciences notion of what space-time is and what energy and matter are. The result of this is that we have a whole zoo of quantum theories, many different interpretations of what's going on at the quantum realm, and someone like Niels Bohr is content to just say that, well, we cannot say what nature is. We can only, what quantum physics tells us is sort of the class of formalisms that we can apply to nature. It doesn't tell us what nature is. It just says, this is what will happen given these conditions. And what Whitehead is doing is protesting against this logical positivism, this lack of realism, which decided to give up on understanding nature and withdraw into the analysis of scientific formalisms and statistics. Whitehead is rejecting this. He's protesting against this move. And it's because he's awoken from this dogmatic slumber, the dogmatic slumber of the Kantian philosophy, which says we can't know what reality is. It's a thing in itself beyond our experience. We can only describe phenomena. He's awakening from that dogmatic slumber. He's also awakening from the Newtonian paradigm. And he's trying to make natural science philosophical again. He's trying to plunge modern science back into the philosophical mode because it thought it was done with philosophy when it came up with the mechanistic ontology, the materialist ontology. But it turns out that ontology doesn't work. If evolutionary theory, if complexity theory, relativity, and quantum theory are not evidence that the mechanistic ontology doesn't work, I don't know what is. So Whitehead's saying mechanism is done. He's making science philosophical again so that it can refound itself upon the organic metaphor rather than the mechanistic one. So he's seeking novel insight into depths of reality as yet unspoken. This is what Rorty and Wittgenstein and other linguistic idealists tried to forbid. But in Process and Reality, Whitehead is aiming for nothing less than the construction of an organic system of the universe that not only brings quantum and relativity theories into coherence, it gathers up scientific truths, aesthetic feelings, and religious values into an integral vision of the whole. So, we can't, in this context, continue to distrust speculative philosophy. If we enter into this book, Process and Reality, with a critical attitude, which has assumed in advance, a priori, that the human mind cannot make contact with the creative activity that is present at the heart of nature, if we deny that we ourselves, that our conscious attention and intention is not itself an expression of that creative activity at the heart of nature, then nothing Whitehead says is going to make any sense to us. He's assuming our experience of a qualitatively rich world, of a living universe, and our experience of ourselves as inhabitants of and creative participants in that universe as the datum from which philosophy starts its work of interpretation. He's assuming it as a datum. He's saying, take this speculative leap with me. Give me this presupposition that reality is a process of creative advance and that we are participants in it. And I will interpret it for you in this essay in cosmology. So we have to trust the speculative method, and he's going to lay that out for us in a second. But he also says we have to distrust language. We don't, in our endeavors to do speculative philosophy, we can't assume that language is an adequate expression of propositions. Now, one of the most novel aspects of Whitehead's new process relational ontology is that he says that there are propositions active in the physical world, propositions that are not linguistic. But for Whitehead, a proposition is, he calls it it's a hybrid prehension. It's an impure prehension that includes both potential and actuality, both form and fact, in a kind of mixture. So, when we make a proposition, as we normally think of it, we're stating some subject and giving it a predicate. We're saying that the sky is blue. Now, the proposition that the sky is blue, it presupposes a whole background network of meanings and other propositions in order for it to have any meaning, right? And in the same way, there are certain relationships that actual occasions in the world, and here I mean actual occasions independently of human beings, totally independent of consciousness. There are propositions at play in the way that light falls on a leaf in the forest. There are propositions at play in the way that hydrogen atoms are affected by a gravitational gradient. There are subjects having experiences in these cases. Propositions are active, they're being felt, right? These situations are being felt in their propositional nature. So one of the errors that philosophy has made, Whitehead tells us, is that it has thought that language and judgment based upon the structure of sentences in human languages, that is an adequate and complete expression of propositions as such. And Whitehead's saying, no, propositions go way beyond language. Language is possible because this sort of inhabitance of potentiality and propositional relationships between physical processes, that is itself what allowed language to arise later on in the evolutionary process. If propositions weren't there from the beginning, language wouldn't have been possible. So Whitehead also says we need to get rid of the faculty psychology. He says we need to get rid of the subject-predicate form of expression, or at least distrust it if we can't get rid of it finally. He says we need to critique the sensationalist doctrine of perception, which is the idea that raw sensory data is the most primal ground of our experience. Whitehead thinks that our experience comes in a far more intimate form than just raw sensory data, like patches of color, or qualia, as they're sometimes called. He thinks that we experience the world not just in terms of the five senses, that these are derivative forms of experience, actually, and that there's a more primordial form of experience that is rooted in the body. It's not perception, sense perception, but more like sense reception. It's the feeling of the environment. It's something more like what Heidegger meant by mood, right? This is more primordial, Whitehead says, than our sensory experience of the external world. So he's critical of the sensationalist doctrine of perception. He's also critical of vacuous actuality, as I mentioned already. He's critical of the Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct from purely subjective experience, because Whitehead wants to say we experience the objective world directly, and our subjective experience is in some ways derivative from our objective experience, our experience of the past actual world flooding into our immediate moment of experience. So Whitehead inverts this Kantian doctrine. He's not a transcendental philosopher, as Kant was. He's what I've called a descendental philosopher. So Whitehead's trying to turn our attention back to the ordinary, stubborn facts of daily life, he says. On the bottom of page 13, Whitehead introduces the actual entity, which is a very important notion. His whole scheme concerns the becoming, the being, and the relatedness of these entities, of actual entities. It's a novel category that he is inventing. They're akin to substances as Aristotle and Descartes had known them, though there are important differences. Because unlike Descartes and Aristotle, Whitehead doesn't so much emphasize the quality of these substances, but he emphasizes their relatedness. Unlike Descartes and Aristotle, substances do require others in order to be what they are. Like Descartes would say, a substance is that which requires nothing but itself to be what it is. And Whitehead is saying, well, actual entities, actual occasions, as he also calls them, do require everything else to be what they are. They are intrinsically, inherently, essentially related, which isn't to say they don't have individuality or subjective immediacy. It's just to say that that immediacy, that individuality, is a moment in its life which includes a passage out of and a passage into a larger community. So again, they become themselves in this community, this nexus of relationship. So Whitehead substances are relational, right? They're not self-identical or isolated, at least, in the way that Descartes and Aristotle and other substance non-process thinkers had imagined. Whitehead tells us that relatedness just means, in his scheme, it means the appropriation of the dead by the living, so that what is divested of its own living immediacy becomes a real component in other living immediacies of becoming. This is Whitehead's creative advance, as he calls it. Whitehead then tells us he's going to assume that the philosophical tradition is of positive value, that we should pay attention to it. He says he's going to try to fuse the two dominant cosmologies of this tradition, namely Plato's Timaeus, one of the most influential cosmological texts for the ancient and medieval world, with the modern scientific mechanistic cosmology that Galileo and Descartes and Newton and Locke devised in the early modern period. And Whitehead tells us that philosophy, if it is to be viable in our era, must turn from criticism of detached questions, must turn away from that to sustained effort of constructive thought, right? This is his response to Rorty, his preemptive response. To be constructive in philosophy, right? Philosophical construction means to frame a scheme of ideas and to explore the interpretation of experience through them. That's what Whitehead's doing in this book. Because, it's not like we could avoid constructing abstract schemes and interpreting experience through them. Science already presupposes a mostly unacknowledged scheme. And it's this scheme of thought that science presupposes has become inadequate, right? So, Whitehead was living through the collapse of the mechanistic cosmology in the early 20th century, but many people chose to ignore the fact that it collapsed. Our civilization has assumed that there are still human beings who are free and creative, and a natural world that is dead and mechanical. That's the modern contract, the modern sort of constitution through which we enact our daily lives. And yet, science itself told us in the early 20th century that ontology is just inadequate. Whitehead tried to repair, not so much to repair, but to reconstruct a new ontology that would be more adequate. But for the last century, most intellectuals and philosophers and scientists have ignored the collapse of the old ontology. We're really in between stories here, as Thomas Berry would say. Whitehead's trying to point out that we can't assume this mechanistic ontology anymore. It's become inadequate, and that our task now as philosophers, and everyone's a philosopher to some degree, our task is to devise a more explicit scheme, right? Be explicit about our metaphysics. Don't have an unacknowledged metaphysical scheme. Whitehead says that all scientists are supposed to say they hate metaphysics, but what they mean is that they don't like having their metaphysics criticized. So we have to acknowledge our scheme, make it explicit, criticize it, and improve it. So that's the preface. We then have a chapter on the speculative method. We have a chapter on the categorical scheme. And we have a chapter called Some Derivative Notions. And I'm going to go through those very quickly in a subsequent lecture.